And joining us now on the debate in Stanford, California, Robert Harrison, professor of Italian literature at Stanford University. And joining us here in studio, Virginia Postrel, author of The Future and Its Enemies. Doug Mann, professor of media studies and sociology at the University of Western Ontario. Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. And we welcome back the authenticity hoax author, Andrew Potter. It's good to have everybody around the table here. Virginia, I must say, you came all the way from LA to do this program, and we are honored by that.
Isn't the modern world wonderful?
Fantastic. And Jordan, you came all the way from 5 subway stops away, and we are honored by that.
Thank you.
And we've never had a professor of Italian literature on this program before, Robert, so we are glad that you're on the line from California for us as well. Let me just take a second here to set up this discussion apropos of my conversation with Andrew that we just had. I guess unlike what Hobbes said, life today is not nasty, brutish, and short. Most of us enjoy freedoms that were unimaginable many generations ago, and yet Andrew's book suggests that there are many who feel that the modern world is not worthy of the highest praise because it makes our lives somehow inauthentic. So Robert Harrison, let me go to you first. Why a lack of confidence among so many today that the modern world is undeniably better?
I don't know that it's a very widespread conviction that the modern world doesn't contain many blessings. I think one of the problems in this regard is that we have such a short memory, culturally and historically speaking, that sometimes it's hard to take stock of all the blessings that have been conferred on first world societies in the 20th century. We have to remember what it was like prior to penicillin, the birth control pill, and air travel and so forth. And we seem to live at such a frenetic immersion in the present that it's a bit of a challenge sometimes for people to be grateful for blessings that would have been unthinkable to some of our even close ancestors.
Virginia, want to follow up?
Well, I think that's right, that the more historical perspective you have, the better off you are in terms of being able to appreciate what you have. But I think there's some other things going on as well. One is that those very blessings come partly because we have a finely tuned sense of discontent. In other words, we don't accept what is as what must be. We think, well, this could be better, that could be better, and this can be as simple as product innovation. You know, the detergent could clean a little better, or the sweater could itch a little less, or something like that. Two big things that have to do with society. And everybody's got different opinions. So part of what we're seeing is people who are discontent with various things, expecting that the modern world will somehow adjust to supply something better to them.
Let's continue to suss out your positions here. Doug Mann, where are you on that question?
I think modernity is a multifaceted phenomenon. I think you can't just break it down into one big whole. And that's, I think, the problem with Andrew's book, amongst other things, is that authenticity isn't
already,
one
eh?
thing.
Okay,
it's many things, and it fades off into critique. Now, I agree with the extreme versions of authenticity being bad that he describes, such as the ridiculous example of the mud floor with the ox and blood mixed in. I've never met anybody like that, and I hope I never do. But nevertheless, there are other less extreme phenomena, such as the environmental movement, which is very valuable, even though it does get carried away at times, obviously. So I wouldn't. I think it's the old problem of throwing away the baby with the dishwater. And so if you throw away the search for authenticity, you might actually throw away the search for critique.
Jordan.
Well, I think there's different kinds of authenticity as well, you know, and I think partly what was being critiqued was sociological authenticity, which is the desire to be part of the correct movement. There's not much being said about existential or psychological authenticity, which has a lot more to do with relationship with the truth, like the truth in relationships, the truth in relation to job, you know, and I think a lot of what people are actually searching for when they look for sociological alternatives, apart from the status seeking, is the deeper meaning that might be found in more psychological approaches to authenticity. Well, those don't offer status in the same way because they tend to be private. So.
Gotcha. Any of those observations you want to pick at yet?
All of them. Let's follow up on the psychological authenticity angle, because there's one sort of aspect that I talk about in the book, and I didn't talk about much because I wanted to have this. I had this sort of pun that I thought worked, was Oprah-icity, right? Like authentic, but they didn't. It doesn't really work as a pun. More on the page, and also in American publishing, if you mention Oprah, everyone sort of freaks out. Especially if it's something negative about Oprah, because
You'll get sued.
You get sued, and you don't get your book on her show, right? So I had a sort of section that had to get taken out. But I do think one of the aspects of the search for the authentic that I don't play out too much, but is sort of in there, is this idea that insofar as being authentic means bringing your outward persona in line with your inner feelings or the inner self, you get this almost a cult of self-disclosure, of this promiscuous disclosure of your emotions and your feelings, and which, people talk about the Diana phenomenon in the 90s, right? This sort of extreme emotionality of it all. And I sort of try and bring that, tie that to the current craze for just putting everything online, pictures of yourself and so on, doing all manner of things. And I guess I wonder that I'd like to sort of see what you think about the search for the personally authentic, because I find it's actually one of the more unpleasant aspects of our modern world is this the decline of the distinction between public and private.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the same problem obtains there as it does with regards to your critique of the sociological phenomena. Narcissism taints these things, right? And so the sort of phenomena that you're talking about with regards to Facebook and continual self-disclosure seems to me to be contaminated by status seeking. It's like I'm more of a victim than you. I have more terrible things to say about what's happened to me. But I think you can make a really clear distinction between that and people's honest attempts to really to have some relationship with the truth in all their dealings with the world. And that doesn't have a public display aspect. It's not praying in public. It's something different.
Let's get Virginia.
Well, I think, first of all, I wouldn't blame Oprah. If you're going to blame somebody for this, you have to go back to the 60s. This is a really reaction of 60s counterculture against the repression of the 50s, to speak in gross, stereotypical ways. And I think one of the appeals of the cult American TV show Mad Men is it shows us the world where people are one thing on the outside and living very different lives inside. And I'm actually writing a book now on glamour, which is sort of the opposite, and it's a very difficult thing to have in the contemporary world. I shouldn't say modern, in the contemporary world, because of this norm of disclosure. The norm is that we will know everything about politicians, movie stars, athletes, your next door neighbor, whomever it might be, and yet at the same time, I think people miss the idea that there would be a certain level of mystery. And I think you're right that being personally authentic, that is true to who you are, does not necessarily mean disclosing every thought that crosses your mind or everything that you do.
If you're personally authentic, you notice when you're doing something embarrassing and stop. Right? Really, you don't override that. I counsel my clients, my clinical clients all the time, to maintain an appropriate level of privacy in their relationships. That's not in contradistinction to being authentic. Authentic doesn't mean you have to tell everyone about yourself nonstop.
But what is difficult today is that it's harder to segment your life. In other words, we talk about public and private, but really we all have multiple public selves. So you have, yourself with your neighbors, yourself with your church members, yourself at work, yourself, your classroom, these sorts of things, and it's harder to keep those things separate.
Right. Doug Mann.
I think there's a great philosophical tradition that you've hinted at, namely existential thought. The whole idea of being true to yourself isn't just wearing Nikes or wearing Levi's or having, as I said, having your floor made out of a certain type of mud, which are all ridiculous ways of seeking authenticity. But I think the idea of being true to yourself, in the sense that you can look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and say, yes, I made the right decision, or no, I didn't make the right decision. And it's not a reference to any sense of cool or to any group of people or subculture. It's just a reference to yourself.
Sure.
And I think, and that sort of authenticity, I think, is very much modern. It's not traditional, it's not pre-modern, and it's very much something that we should value.
Let me get Robert Harrison in here to react, first of all, to a quote I want to read from David Suzuki. And for our friends from California, if you don't know who he is, he's, I guess, the closest thing we've got to Al Gore in Canada. He is Mr. Environmentalism. And here's what he had to say in a piece that he did last year. Yes, our world now provides a cornucopia of wondrous consumer goods, but at what cost? When I was a child, back doors would open at 5:30 or 6 o'clock as parents called kids for supper. We were out playing in grassy fields, ditches, or creeks. We drank from rivers and lakes and caught and ate fish, all without worrying about what chemicals might be in them. When I was a child, the oceans were still rich with marine life, places like the Amazon and Congo were still unexplored ecosystems, and nuclear weapons and the arms race were still to come. The population has tripled since then. Each of us now carries dozens of toxic chemicals embedded within us. Cancer has become the biggest killer, and we have poisoned our air, water, and soil. Okay, maybe just an initial reaction, Robert, and then I'll come in with a follow-up after that.
Well, initial reaction is that those are a number of statements, some of which may well be true, and others may not lead us very far in this discussion. Even conceding that all that was said is the case, the question of whether authenticity still has a role to play in our lives is one that remains open. I was a little surprised that Andrew Potter mentions Heidegger in one instance of his book, but mentions Heidegger's thoughts on boredom, which I think are very interesting, and you know, Andrew did well to bring that up. But the philosopher who made the whole concept of authenticity put it most in the foreground is the German Martin Heidegger, and there it had nothing to do in his understanding with being true to yourself as such. It had nothing to do with status seeking. It was just, as Pindar, the ancient Greek poet, said, become who you already are. For Martin Heidegger, to be authentic means to take stock of the fact that I am first and foremost a mortal human being, and that I have to make my mortality my own. I have to somehow become this finitude that I am, and all the strategies by which we evade this mortality and the crisis of finitude are things that he ascribed to inauthenticity. Those moments, which are very rare in Heidegger's understanding of them, those moments of authenticity are not moments that can be communicated necessarily to others. They don't easily translate into language. They have nothing to do with Facebook or telling my friend or my neighbor who I really am as a person. They are mostly moments of silence. And I think that if one were to subtract the possibility of this authentic authenticity, I believe Andrew Potter is speaking mostly about inauthentic modes of authenticity. I would not want to do away with the imperative to maintain a certain authenticity when it comes to who we are in our fundamental mode of being in the world.
Equal time for Andrew.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. There's a long reason why I didn't have a lot on Heidegger in the book. The main one is my publisher was kind of like, get rid of all this stuff, right? I actually wrote a long conclusion on Heidegger and Asian philosophy and all this stuff that nobody wants to read and nobody wants to hear about. The mode of being that Robert's talking about, that sort of becoming who you are, is something that I endorse. It's what I was trying to point to in the book was that that way of being and the name for that has been highly distorted in our popular vocabulary. That it has become wrapped up in what is basically a form of thinking about the modern world that I find unhelpful. And so to that extent, and that's why I sort of have this long list of the ways in which the word authentic is used to sell everything from skateboards to chainsaws, and the way it's used to describe everything from Oprah to Sarah Palin to Obama.
To a Van Gogh painting.
To a Van Gogh painting in a very unhelpful way. And so it's not that I think that Heidegger's way of talking about it is wrong, or that Lao Tzu's way of talking about the authentic self is wrong. It's just that the way the vast majority of people in our society talk about it in our popular culture is thoroughly misguided. So,
Jordan.
Well, it's kind of interesting to think about this from a temperamental perspective too, because you can imagine that a substantial majority of the population are basically conservative, and they're perfectly willing to seek status and well-being within the confines of the culture. But then there's people who are more open and more liberal and more creative, and their tendency is always going to be to adopt a relatively countercultural position and to try to build up little dominance hierarchies outside of this society. And I think that's partly why Andrew was able to point out and discover, especially in his blog, that the idea of the return to the authentic has been around since the Romans in exactly the same way. So people often believe that just because they're against something, so in this case it would be modern culture, that the fact that they're against something that everyone else is for makes them more authentic. And it doesn't. It just makes them like they're the cutout, they're the negative space in culture, and it's not individual or creative.
Doug.
I think the biggest problem, or the biggest thing that bothered me about Andrew's book, is that I just don't think the quest for authenticity is all that important in most people's lives. And I don't mean to offend you, Andrew, but I detected a distinct class bias in the book, and that you're really talking about rich people and the upper middle class, and you're not talking about the average working person who wakes up in the morning, has their coffee, maybe even checks their email, but they certainly don't sit around thinking about mud floors or what brand name consumer goods to buy in the afternoon, because they're going to work. And frankly, I doubt if your book applies more to more than maybe 10% or 5% of North America.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should say that, because I got an email from someone who said, I read your book along with the book Stuff White People Like, right? and he said, basically, your book is the theory of everything that's being talked about there. And I couldn't agree more, that actually what we're talking about, the kind of authenticity I'm talking about is largely the concern of college-educated, middle to upper middle class white people in North America. But does that mean that's 10% of the population? No, I think it's substantially higher. And when you add the fact that it's largely the people who are dominated the media and have access to the media, I think their way of looking at the world, their preferred forms of living are ones that are being set as archetypical or the standard for the rest of society. I mean, there was this story in the New York Times a couple weeks ago about national parks in the United States. You might have seen this. Attendance is overwhelmingly white. They're having a lot of trouble getting blacks and Hispanics to go in particular. And I was talking with a friend of mine who's actually from India. And I said, this is interesting. And she said, the question people should be asking is, what is it with white people in nature? Right? Like, why are you guys so obsessed with it, right? And so I agree, but I disagree that it doesn't apply, because I think that way of talking is becoming
Let me get Virginia on that. Do you think, first of all, do you agree with Doug that this is an irrelevant discussion for 90% of the population?
Well, it depends on what you mean by this. But, I mean, I think there is the what white people like issue, but there is also the question of the attitude represented by the David Suzuki quote, and also represented by a kind of trickle down Heidegger, which says that the modern project or the Baconian view of the universe, or the desire to improve the state of human beings, to extend longevity, to increase comfort, to make it so women don't have to clean the clothes in the river, that is bad. Let's not call it, whether we call it authentic or something else, that is bad. And that has profound effects, actually, for people who are not rich. In fact, the concern for nature is, in a sense, a luxury good. That when you are very poor, when you're in a subsistence type economy, nature is, a large degree the enemy. When you read that quote, I kept thinking, I'm from the American South, and while I wasn't born in 1934, as we learned earlier in the earlier segment, my father was. In fact, he was born today, in 1934.
Happy birthday, Dad.
And in the American South, you did not drink from the water unless you want to get typhoid fever. I mean, there were plenty. This bucolic world in which nothing ever went bad is just a myth. But like other forms of glamour, which is what I would say it is, it's a glamorization of the past. It's a myth that contains a truth about what the audience desires.
Let me get Jordan, and then we'll go to California and get Robert to come in after that.
Well, we have to remember that in Canada, people would freeze to death for like 6 or 7 months of the year unless they had a fairly high degree of civilized luxury, you know. And my grandfather lived in a log cabin on the Saskatchewan prairie, and it was regularly -50 there. And
That was a pretty authentic life.
very authentic. My grandmother chopped enough wood to last through the whole winter, as well as doing all sorts of unbelievably heavy labor. And that's only 2 generations ago. Like, Suzuki had a privileged childhood by anyone's standards. And he remembers this time when, for a brief moment, for a few people in a very small place, the forces of nature and culture were optimally balanced. If you were bringing to your judgment the perspective of a 5-year-old boy. Yeah. So, you know, that argument just has no force.
I think
The
for the
nostalgia
record,
for childhood is
Yeah, well,
something we
he's got
haven't
that
talked
tangled
about.
up
Yeah.
in that.
I think for the record, he was one of those people
He
who
was
ended up
interned. He
interred in
did
a
end up
Japanese Canadian camp during World
Yeah.
War II. So he didn't have a completely ideal childhood.
makes it-
But I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying. Go ahead. Let's Robert, have you come in on this point.
Yeah, there are many different aspects of modernity that we've been talking about, and one can say that there have been all sorts of things that we should be grateful for, and that's true, but one cannot overestimate the kind of traumatic consequences and the convulsions and shock effect that a complete alteration in our basic mode of being on the earth that came about with the modern period. And I'm talking about something I would call like the end of the Neolithic era, where a generation or two ago, the vast majority of even North American citizens had the certainty about where they are going to be buried. They were going to be buried more or less where their ancestors were buried. Now we live in a time when very few people would be able to answer the question, where am I going to be buried? By the same token, very few of us in first world societies know where the food that we consume comes from. We don't see the animals, the flocks from which our meat comes from, or the chickens from the eggs. So these are 2 examples of 2 huge, momentous cultural revolutions that have completely altered a way of life within a generation or 2. And it's unrealistic to not expect that our generation or our parents' generation would not somehow feel the profound anxiety and discomfort that comes with these sort of rapid shifts in our way of life. So part of what is under discussion here is a cultural revolution, the likes of which we have not seen for a very, very long time.
Doug Mann.
Yeah, one of the things that does come up in the book, and I found quite interesting, and we haven't talked about so far, is political modernity. You know, the search for rights, search for sexual equality, racial equality, and so forth. And that really comes out of, I think, 17th, 18th century, out of the English Civil War, French Revolution, later revolutions of the 19th century. And all of those were very violent conflicts. And sure, they wouldn't have used the term authenticity in the English Civil War, but they would have used ideals and pictures of golden ages, as the Diggers and the Levelers did. You know, so they always had in their minds, you know, these images of maybe not perfect societies, although certainly the French revolutionaries did, but really good societies that didn't exist in their own day. So, and these things are what motivated the revolutionaries. And the same thing, I think, happened in the 60s with the women's movement and the gay liberation and so forth. You know, and so if they didn't have something like authenticity, although, you know, they probably wouldn't have used the word, they probably wouldn't have done a lot of what they did.
Virginia.
Well, 2 points. First, I think, well, one little point, which is this very bizarre to suggest that most of us in North America 2 generations ago would have been buried near where our ancestors were buried. But since most of us are not Aboriginal people, indigenous peoples, but the broader point is, I think a lot of this anxiety is about specialization. Not necessarily exactly where your food is coming from or any specific thing. Those become sort of the reification of the general anxiety. But the modern extended order depends on people being good at certain things, doing the things that they're good at, and specializing. And so if you look at something like this TV show, it's not only us sitting around here, there are people who know all about the cameras and the makeups and the sound, and there are unseen people who are handling the satellites and all of this. And I have no idea how to run a camera or any of these things. And so we go through life benefiting from this enormous amount of knowledge that's embedded in the world around us. But it's about things we think we ought to understand understand, as opposed to in an earlier era, let's say 300 years ago, people were equally ignorant, but it was a different kind of ignorance. And so you turn to magic or religion, which we haven't talked about.
Which we shall, but I want to go, you've given me a good segue to play a clip from an interview that we did recently on the program with a guy named Dan Gardner, who's a writer with the Ottawa Citizen, and he's got a new book out called Future Babel, in which we always seem to want to go to the experts to ask them what's going to happen next, and of course they don't know, but we ask them and we assume they know, and we listen to what they say as if it's come down from Mount Sinai, but they're 90% of the time wrong. Stand by, JP, you get the first hit at this one once we play the clip. Michael, if you would, roll tape.
The brain is an organism that wants to make sense of the universe.
We're wired to do that.
We're wired to do that. We're compulsive. It happens automatically. And when you look into the future and you see swirling chaos, you see a void, you see total uncertainty, that's terrifying.
Okay, that's Dan. Now, take me back to northern Alberta where it all started for you. Speaking of living in chaos and not knowing, I mean, what's going on psychologically in the brain as you weigh the different options for what kind of a life you can and want to lead when you're there?
Well, people definitely want to impose a structure of meaning on things because that simplifies the choices, the moral choices that they have to make. So they use what are technically known as heuristics, and those are simple, basic structures that you can solve general problems with. And you could say in a sense that civilization is a heuristic like that. It's a set of tools we have, some of which are internal and some of which are external, that allow us rapidly to solve a set of problems. And we don't like to have those structures disrupted because all the problems that they solve might come leaping back. But there's another element too that goes along with this desire to make sense out of things, and that's the building of your capacity to make sense out of things on your own. And people do that by expanding their general capabilities. So every time you learn something that's worth learning, or every time you improve your conversational abilities or so forth, or your skills, then you also increase your ability to make sense out of the world. And I believe that often people feel that that individual capacity to make meaning is being subverted by the social capacity. And that a lot of what we see as an objection to modernity is people's perfectly reasonable terror of massive, hyper-efficient, factory-like organizations invading everything, which of course is exactly what they do.
Virginia, do we have a more difficult time nowadays trying to make sense of the future than we did before?
Well, I think we have an increasing understanding that it's not as predictable as we thought it was. It was never as predictable as we thought it was. The future was always full of surprises, but we had, for example, a much more unitary media. Media is plural, but anyway, more unitary press that was more capable of presenting us with a single narrative. And so what we have now is we're suddenly aware that of all this diversity. I mean, I grew up in the American South. I grew up in the Bible Belt. Fundamentalists are nothing new. I grew up with these people, but suddenly in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected, all the people in New York were, oh my God, there are these people who believe in Jesus. Now, and people think it's something new, and partly it's because people who used to be poor and uneducated are now affluent and educated and therefore influential. But there was a lot of fragmentation, and you talked about gays and they were always there, but now suddenly it's acknowledged. So there's a lot more acknowledgement of the many places that cultural surprise can come from.
I want to talk technology for a second, and to do that, I'm going to bring Robert Harrison in here. Because before I read the quote, though, Michael, don't put this up yet. Let me introduce it this way. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, killed 3 people, injured dozens more, eventually turned in by his brother. His real name, Theodore Kaczynski, everybody knew him as the Unabomber, was a gifted mathematician, became a hermit as some kind of protest, I guess, to technological culture. And now Robert Harrison wrote about this in September of 2009 in a piece called Entitled Opinions, or he spoke rather. Let's put this up. We are barely conscious of the fact that technology is our master. It has insinuated itself into our human relations, into our relations with our bodies, with the earth, with the other species, in knowledge, in every possible sphere of human activity and reflection. Technology has already given the frame within which we are allowed to operate, and I think Kaczynski is right about that. Okay, Professor Harrison, our view of technology is that becoming the central criterion about how one feels about the contemporary world.
Well, our view about technology is one thing, and technicity, which is the kind of framework that technology imposes on every one of our activities, I think is a different thing. And it's what we're not aware of about technology's insertion into our psyches and our lived world that worries me. And I think that one of the manifestations of this covert technicity is our obsession these days with explanation versus understanding. And I think a lot of us, many of us, I suppose we're all convoked here on this television program in order to provide explanations for phenomena that might otherwise leave people confounded and disoriented. And we enlist people to provide us with explanations for things that we don't understand, almost as if these are technical explanations. We're all very good at that. We're trained at that. Some of us more sociologically oriented, some more philosophically oriented, and so forth. But explanation cannot take the place of true understanding. I think Kaczynski, in a strange way, went on a sort of quest for not authenticity per se, but to understand how technology has insinuated itself in every aspect of our existence. And far from being an apologist for his methods or even the majority of ideas, I think that there's something in his challenge that we do have to take seriously.
You want to follow up on that, Andrew? You make a distinction between
I would distinguish between themes and theses, right, to sort of make a philosopher's distinction. The general theme that technology is something we should be wary about, I agree with, right? The specific thesis, right, blow up people who are, working in that area is something I completely disagree with. And I think even setting that aside, yeah, technology is something we should be concerned about. But we've been concerned about technology since the invention of fire, right? Our earliest myths are myths about the fear of technology. And it's one thing to say, I'm worried about where technology is going. It's interesting to be saying that when the person telling us to be wary about it is live by video conference from California, right? A technology that we completely sort of were swimming in and don't even think twice about. And so
take it for granted.
Take it for granted. And so while I have anxieties about too much email on my BlackBerry and Facebook and all these things, the kids I used to teach at university certainly don't. I think we need to realize that a lot of anxiety is just simply the anxiety of getting older.
Doug.
Yeah, I generally speaking agree with what Andrew just said. But I think that one of the big problems is that we've gone through a fundamental revolution in the last 15 years, the digital revolution, which everybody knows about, everybody's a part of really, and you can't escape it even if you wanted to, unless you're Ted Kaczynski living in a log cabin. But the thing is, I think society and people have fundamentally changed the way they interact with each other, the way we teach students, the way we read or don't read, and the way we communicate. And those things are really new. They're not just part of a long history of technological changes, which they are, of course, in the literal sense, but something new has happened as of roughly 1995 and following. And that's, I think, a degraded way of communicating with people, and the lack of literacy in the students coming to universities as two examples.
Robert Harrison wanted back in.
Oh, just to say that, again, what I heard from Andrew there was another sort of explanation about our relative malaise with technology, whereas I wasn't talking about the way in which email is intruding in my life or too much technology here or there. I was trying to point to the kind of recesses in our lives where technology is present without our being directly aware of it. The way it predetermines our human relations between friends, between colleagues, perhaps even between spouses. There's a covert history of technology that requires a kind of thoughtfulness that doesn't always reduce itself to an order of explanation.
Okay, just a note to the control room here. We're less than 5 minutes to go, so I'm going to suggest we drop the Fukuyama graphic and let's go straight to this clip from the Rally to Restore Sanity and/or Fear, which took place in Washington a few weeks ago, that Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert special. And here's what I guess the most trusted man in America, not Walter Cronkite, Jon Stewart, had to say then. Roll tape, please.
Because we know instinctively as a people that if we are to get through the darkness and back into the light, we have to work together. And the truth is, there will always be darkness. And sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel isn't the promised land. Sometimes it's just New Jersey.
Okay, everybody, let's finish up on this. For much of our history, we have lived with some sense of promise that would dispel the darkness. Is it possible that we don't know how to be grateful for what we have now because it's only New Jersey? Jordan.
Well, I would say that our collective mission with regards to materialistic salvation has been in large part achieved. I mean, it hasn't been distributed all over the world,
Right.
but in many situations, people have as much as they need and more. And so the compelling nature of us moving against nature has started to disappear because in many ways we won the battle, and I think that has left a void.
Virginia.
I think that's actually right, that we spent, the great project of the 20th century was getting to not bad for everyone. And it had many different, we debated different ways to do it, and we've gotten to not bad, and
We're
the
at not
question
bad
is,
now.
what comes next? And that's a very interesting question. I think it's exciting and an interesting time to live, and I think I am positive about the future, but I also like New Jersey.
Robert Harrison, how about you?
No, I agree there that it's that the darkness will always be there, and that there's the fact that we've by and large won the fight, as someone mentioned, is something that creates a danger of disappointment. Sometimes the success breeds disappointment because one doesn't know what to do with oneself. Having been victorious. And I think this is the interesting thing about Andrew's book at the end there, where he speaks about the lingering danger that boredom represents for our society. That what do we do in our state of boredom in order to avoid it? And that's where disappointment becomes a distinct danger that we really should try to supplant with gratitude. I agree.
Doug Mann.
I think modernity has created a wealthy consumer society that certainly has created more than enough stuff for us to own and buy. However, it hasn't distributed it very well. And technology is always going to advance and always going to cause problems. So the idea that modernity is something we have to be suspicious of, I think it won't go away.
Andrew, you get the last word.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, the line is that all nostalgia is nostalgia for the present, right? It's a manifestation of your own current state of unhappiness. And you look backwards and imagine a time when you actually were happy. You probably weren't, right? But that sense of disquiet does create a friction, which leads us to always challenge where we're going and hope for a better world. And I think that's a good thing.
I want to thank everybody for this very erudite discussion today, starting with Robert Pogue Harrison, a professor of Italian literature at Stanford University. Grazie mille, signora, and ci vediamo alla prossima volta. Ciao.
A presto, grazie.
A presto, signora. Si, okay. Where are we going next? Okay, Doug Mann from the Media Studies at University of Western Ontario. On the other side of the table, Virginia Postrel. Did I get that close?
Very good.
You were going to say molto bene, but
Molto
okay.
buono.
Future,
Bravo.
Future and Its Enemies, The Substance of Style is her book. And of course, Jordan Peterson, a familiar face in these parts, psychologist at the University of Toronto. And the author himself, Andrew Potter, The Authenticity Hoax is his latest. Thanks so much, everybody.